Welcome to the futurist public intellectual. The pro-Palestine protests are spreading across various college campuses in the U.S. after over 100 protesters were arrested at Columbia University last week, 120 at NYU, and over 60 at Yale. The pro-Palestine sentiment has reached a flashpoint in the popular culture. Students are creating on-campus encampments with tents, making the protests front and center. With Passover being this week, it's an even more tense time for students to be anti-Israel. While a public intellectual like myself can appreciate the exercise of free speech these protests represent, I do have to question what the motivation of these protesting students are. Unlike the anti-Vietnam student protests of the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. is not directly involved with the Israel-Hamas conflict. The students are siding with a foreign entity whom they don't necessarily have a connection to. If the protesters were all Palestinians, Arabs, or at least Muslim, I could understand why they're protesting. But why are agnostic white Americans protesting? It's also confusing because the Israel-Hamas conflict has inspired such nationwide protest, while the ongoing war in Ukraine has not, despite Ukraine's clear legitimacy as a state, while Palestine's status has been in limbo for decades. Regardless of the protesters themselves, there seems to be a lot of confusion around people's specific political positions. Let's be clear. Being pro-Palestine is not the same as being pro-Hamas. Even if one sympathizes with the Palestinians, that doesn't necessarily mean that one condones Hamas. If you conflate Palestine with Hamas, then it's easy to interpret the situation as an endorsement of violence. Furthermore, being against Israel's actions in this conflict is not the same as being anti-Semitic. You don't have to hate Jews to condemn Israel's actions, just like you don't have to hate Americans to condemn the U.S.'s foreign policy. In fact, one could be very supportive of the state of Israel while being disgusted by the death count of Palestinians. The student protesters need to be a lot clearer about what the specifics of their positions are. I think that it's inevitable for a neutral party like myself to point out the obvious. There will clearly be no end to this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians if each side makes demands without consideration for the other. At some point, both sides will have to acknowledge that Israel was created from land that was originally possessed by the Palestinians. So the only fair solution to a land that is holy to both parties is for both parties to live together. Whether that's one state with Jews and Arabs or two states for each party, learning to live together is the only solution that makes sense. Thank you for listening to the Futurist Public Intellectual.